I never intended my life to shrink into such a tight, predictable routine. At 53, I had settled into a rhythm that, while comfortable, had grown unbearably quiet. My mornings were spent sipping coffee on the worn leather armchair by the window, afternoons tidying the house, and evenings flipping through novels that couldn't hold my interest. My grown children rarely called. My friendships had dulled over the years, and the only semblance of excitement was my bi-weekly trips to the grocery store. It was on one of those unremarkable Thursdays that I first saw him. The produce aisle, where I always started, was buzzing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the faint chatter of shoppers. I reached for a head of lettuce, and as I turned, my hand grazed his by accident. "Oh, sorry about that," he said with a sheepish smile, stepping back slightly. "It's fine," I replied, glancing up, and there he was. He couldn't have been older than his late 20s, tall, with sandy blonde hair and the kind of easy grin that belonged to someone who hadn't yet been ground down by life. But it wasn't just his looks that caught me off guard. It was the way he looked at me, with genuine attention and an openness I hadn't encountered in years. "Lettuce wars, huh?" he joked, gesturing to the greens. I chuckled, surprised at how natural it felt to laugh. "It's a fierce competition." He picked up a head of romaine and held it aloft as though considering it for an art installation. "This one feels like a winner," he declared, then added, "I'm Ryan, by the way." "Evelyn," I replied, the syllables of my own name feeling foreign on my tongue. What followed was brief, a minute or two of polite chatter about recipes and a comment about the weather. But when he walked away, pushing his cart toward the dairy section, I stood rooted to the spot, gripping my lettuce and trying to remember the last time someone had looked at me like that. It wasn't flirtation, it was something quieter. Kindness, maybe. Interest. And it was enough to leave me walking through the aisles with a strange lightness in my chest, my usual grocery list forgotten as I retraced our fleeting interaction in my mind. By the time I reached the checkout line, he was gone. But the spark of that moment lingered, a small ember glowing in the otherwise monotonous fabric of my life. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering what, if anything, might happen next. It wasn't long before I saw him again. 2 weeks later, on another mundane Thursday, he appeared in the cereal aisle. I was deliberating between brands, my basket resting on the crook of my arm, when his voice startled me. "Pro tip, go for the one with the almonds," Ryan said, pointing at the box I was holding. I turned, startled but pleased, and there he was, that easy grin still intact. "You again," I said, unable to hide my smile. "Small town, small grocery store," he replied with a shrug. "Fancy meeting you here, Evelyn." I couldn't help but laugh. "Do you always dispense cereal advice to strangers?" "Only to those who look like they might appreciate it." We chatted for a while, weaving through the aisles together as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He told me he'd recently moved to town for work. He managed a small marketing team at a local firm. I shared tidbits about the town, recommending places for coffee and warning him about the never-ending roadworks on Main Street. There was an ease to our conversation that caught me off guard. I felt younger, lighter, as though the weight of my carefully constructed walls had been momentarily lifted. By the time we reached the checkout line, I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. And to my surprise, neither did he. "Hey," he said, pausing by the sliding doors. "I usually stop by the cafe down the street after this, grab a coffee and catch up on some reading. You should join me sometime." For a moment I hesitated. I could feel the old voice of caution whispering in my mind. What would people think? What would he think if he knew how much older I was? But there was something so genuine about him, so devoid of pretense, that I found myself nodding. "I'd like that," I said softly. And just like that, it became a ritual. Every other week, after our accidental grocery store meetings, we'd find ourselves at that cozy cafe, steaming mugs of coffee between us as we talked about everything and nothing. Ryan had a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. He asked questions, laughed at my stories, and shared pieces of his life with an openness that felt both unfamiliar and refreshing. I learned he had a younger sister he was close to, that he loved old films, and that he was hopelessly bad at baking despite his efforts. In turn, I found myself sharing parts of my life I hadn't spoken about in years. How I used to love painting, how the quiet of my house sometimes felt more like a weight than a comfort. Somewhere between those conversations, something began to shift. My once lonely grocery store trips became something I looked forward to, my days punctuated by the hope of seeing him again. And with each meeting, I could feel a small, unfamiliar warmth spreading in my chest. I told myself it was just friendship, that this connection was nothing more than two people finding joy in each other's company. But late at night, when the house was still and my thoughts ran unchecked, I wondered if I was lying to myself. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, during one of our cafe rituals. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries, the soft murmur of conversations weaving a warm cocoon around us. Ryan sat across from me, animatedly recounting a story about his disastrous attempt at assembling a bookshelf the night before. And when the whole thing collapsed, I just sat there with a screwdriver in my hand, wondering if IKEA has a hotline for emotionally shattered customers. He finished, laughing at himself. I laughed too, my head tipping back as the sound filled the cozy space. It felt so good to laugh like that, unrestrained, carefree. Ryan's laughter faded first, and when I looked back at him, his eyes were on me, a softness there that stopped me cold. "What?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. But the way he looked at me lingered, a quiet intensity that made my heart flutter. The moment passed, and our conversation resumed, but something had shifted. I couldn't shake the way his gaze had made me feel. Seen, cherished, beautiful in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and a half-finished novel, the realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. I had feelings for Ryan. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. My breath caught, and I set the wine glass down, staring blankly at the wall as the truth settled over me. I wasn't sure when it had begun. Was it the first time he smiled at me in the grocery store? Or the way he always seemed to genuinely care about what I had to say? Perhaps it was how he made me feel like a person again, not just a shadow drifting through a quiet, lonely life. But with that realization came a rush of fears. He was younger, significantly so. What would he think if he knew how I felt? Would he be flattered, or horrified? And what about everyone else? The whispers, the judgment, the labels that society so easily handed out. I tried to reason with myself, to push the feelings away. This was just a fleeting infatuation, I told myself. A spark of excitement in a life that had grown too dull. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew I was lying. My feelings for Ryan weren't fleeting. They were real, raw, and growing stronger with every moment we spent together. I fell asleep that night with my heart and mind in turmoil, caught between the longing to explore this newfound emotion and the fear of what it could mean for both of us. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to keep my feelings under wraps, to preserve the easy rhythm Ryan and I had established, but it was impossible to look at him the same way. Every smile, every casual touch on my arm, every laugh we shared felt amplified now, charged with a meaning he didn't know existed. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversations and his gestures in my mind. Was I imagining the way his gaze lingered on me sometimes? Could there be something more beneath his friendliness? Or was I only seeing what I desperately wanted to believe? The fear of being wrong kept me from acting on my feelings. What if I ruined everything? What if I misread his kindness as something it wasn't and destroyed the one connection that had breathed life back into my dull existence? But the other voice, the hopeful one, whispered louder with each passing day. Why shouldn't I follow my heart? Wasn't I allowed to want happiness, even if it came in an unexpected form? Society's judgment loomed like a dark cloud over my thoughts. What would people think of a woman in her 50s daring to fall for someone much younger? Would they see me as foolish, desperate, even predatory? The weight of those potential accusations pressed heavily on my chest. And then, there was Ryan himself. How would he react if he knew? He might laugh it off, gently letting me down, or worse, pull away entirely. The mere idea of losing him, even as a friend, was unbearable. Yet, despite my fears, I couldn't deny the joy he brought into my life. He made me feel alive, seen, appreciated in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. One rainy afternoon, as we sat in his car after a coffee run, Ryan turned to me, his face lit by the faint glow of the dashboard. "Elaine," he said softly, his voice almost hesitant, "you're one of the coolest people I've ever met. You know that, right?" I laughed, brushing off the compliment with a wave of my hand, but his expression didn't waver. "I mean it," he insisted. "You've got this way of looking at life that makes it all feel brighter. You don't even realize how much of an impact you have." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, kind and warm, but also terrifying in their sincerity. I didn't know what to say, so I mumbled a thank you, staring out at the rain-slicked windshield to hide the tears welling in my eyes. Later that night, alone in my quiet house, I realized something important. My feelings for Ryan might have come unexpectedly, and the world might see them as unconventional or even wrong, but they were mine. For the first time in years, I felt something profound, something worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to justify the risk. As the days passed, I found myself longing for a moment of true closeness with Ryan, a space where we could speak freely, without the hum of a cafe or the bustle of a grocery store in the background. It wasn't that our friendship lacked substance, but I wanted something more intimate, a setting that allowed for a deeper connection. The idea of inviting him to my home began to take shape, but with it came a tide of apprehension. What reason could I give without making it seem like something more? I didn't want to scare him away, or worse, expose my feelings before I even understood them myself. One evening, as we sat on a park bench sharing a pastry we had impulsively bought from a bakery, Ryan mentioned his passion for cooking. "I've been experimenting with making pasta from scratch," he said, his eyes lighting up as he spoke. "It's surprisingly therapeutic, but I'm still figuring out the sauce game." "You don't happen to have any secret recipes, do you?" I laughed, though my heart was pounding. Was this the opportunity I'd been searching for? "Well," I said, feigning casualness, "I might have a recipe or two, but they're best enjoyed fresh. How about this? You bring the pasta and I'll handle the sauce. We can put our culinary skills to the test together." Ryan's smile was immediate and genuine, the kind that sent warmth straight to my core. "Deal," he said without hesitation. As the date approached, my nerves only grew. I spent far too much time deciding on a playlist, arranging my small kitchen so it felt welcoming but not overly staged. Every detail mattered, from the lighting to the wine I carefully selected, hoping it would strike the right balance of casual and thoughtful. The night finally arrived. When the doorbell rang, I felt a surge of both excitement and panic. I smoothed my blouse, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, and opened the door. Ryan stood there, holding a brown paper bag, and wearing an easy grin that instantly eased my nerves. "I come bearing pasta," he said with mock seriousness. "And I've got the sauce," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. In my kitchen, we worked side by side, laughter punctuating our conversation as flour dusted the countertops and the smell of garlic filled the air. I found myself watching him when he wasn't looking. The way he concentrated as he rolled out the dough, the way his sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, revealing strong, capable arms. When we finally sat down to eat, the atmosphere felt different, warmer, more charged. The flickering candlelight cast soft shadows on his face, and as we clinked glasses, I caught his gaze lingering on me just a second too long. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "this is the best meal I've had in ages. But I think it's more about the company than the food." I smiled, feeling a mix of exhilaration and vulnerability. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he felt the same spark I did. The evening unfolded like a slow dance, tentative at first, but gradually finding a rhythm that felt almost natural. After dinner, we moved into the living room, where I'd placed 2 glasses of wine on the coffee table, just enough to unwind without losing ourselves to the evening. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as it always did with him, yet now there was an unspoken undercurrent, a current of connection that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. Ryan talked about his childhood in a small town, how his parents had always dreamed of more for him, pushing him to chase success at the cost of intimacy. It was a story of ambition but also isolation. He spoke of his struggle to find a balance between chasing his dreams and creating meaningful relationships. I found myself listening intently, drawn to the rawness of his words. There was something deeply human in his vulnerability, something I hadn't expected from someone so much younger. I think that's why I've always enjoyed our time together, he said, his voice quieter now, the glow from the fireplace casting a warm light on his face. It feels different with you. It's easy to just be, without any pressure, you know. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I smiled softly, not quite trusting myself to speak, unsure if my heart was leading me toward something more, or if I was simply seeing what I wanted to see. But then he did something unexpected. He reached across the couch, his hand brushing mine with a gentle, tentative touch. It was an innocent gesture, a friendly one at first, but it carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. I looked down at our hands, the contrast of his youth and my age undeniable. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Could this be real? Was I crossing a line I shouldn't? But then I felt it, the warmth from his hand, the quiet confidence that said he was not afraid of me, of my age, of any of it. His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw something I hadn't expected: understanding, connection, and perhaps something more. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the moment linger, feeling the unspoken tension between us, the charge in the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel scared of what might come next. Ryan leaned in slightly, his face inches from mine. His breath was warm, his presence intoxicating. I've been wanting to kiss you for a while now, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of excitement and disbelief. In that instant, I understood everything. The uncertainty, the fear, the thrill of it all. This was real, and it was happening. Without thinking, I closed the space between us. Our lips met in a kiss that was slow and tender, but filled with a depth of emotion that both surprised and overwhelmed me. I had kissed many men in my life, but this was different. It was as though the kiss held everything. Our pasts, our desires, and our fears. It was a promise and a question all at once. As we pulled away, our foreheads resting together, I realized something vital. Age, societal expectations, and the boundaries we set for ourselves meant very little in the face of something this genuine. I was no longer worried about what others would think, no longer concerned about the future or the judgment that might come. In that moment, all that mattered was the connection between us, and how deeply it resonated in my heart. As Ryan left that night, his words lingered in the air, his touch still warm on my skin. I stood by the door, watching him walk away into the night, a mix of emotions swirling within me. There was a part of me that couldn't quite grasp what had just happened, as if I were still suspended in a space between reality and a dream. I had spent so many years alone, telling myself that the days of passion, of feeling deeply for someone, were behind me, that I had moved past that chapter, settling into a quiet, comfortable routine. And then Ryan came into my life like a wave crashing against the shore, unexpected, unpredictable, and entirely transformative. I sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. My mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, from how ridiculous it seemed, to how beautiful it felt, to how terrified I was of what could come next. Love, at any stage in life, carried its challenges, but for someone like me, someone who had built walls to protect herself from the disappointments of the past, it felt like a risk too great to take. But then I thought about the connection between us. It wasn't a fleeting infatuation. It wasn't simply a passing attraction. It was something deeper, something that transcended age, time, and experience. We were two souls who had found each other when they least expected it, and that realization shifted something inside of me. I thought about the fears I'd carried, the doubts about whether this could ever work. Society had always taught me to be cautious with love, to stick to what was familiar, what was safe. But what if that wasn't the point? What if love wasn't about adhering to norms or fitting into a mold? What if it was about embracing the unexpected, about throwing caution to the wind and allowing yourself to feel, to live fully, without fear of judgment? As I reflected on the night, a sense of peace settled over me. I had spent too many years holding back, telling myself that my time had passed, that I was too old to experience something like this again. But love didn't come with a timeline. It didn't care about age or circumstances. It simply existed, quietly, waiting to be recognized. Ryan had shown me that, had reminded me of the beauty that still lived inside me, despite the years that had passed. In his presence, I felt alive again, not just physically, but in a way that touched my soul. I saw myself, not as a woman defined by her age, but as someone capable of love, desire, and connection, no matter how old she was. The reality of it all didn't escape me. The world would judge, people would talk, and perhaps there would be obstacles ahead. But that night, with the taste of his kiss still lingering on my lips, I realized that none of it mattered. This was mine. This was our story. And so I would not shy away from it. I would no longer hide behind the walls I had built out of fear. I had lived for too long in the shadows of my own doubts, and now I was ready to step into the light. Age wasn't a barrier. It was just a number. What truly mattered was the depth of our connection, and that was something I would embrace without hesitation. Love, at any stage of life, had the power to transform. And now, I knew that the heart had no expiration date. It could feel, it could grow, and it could love just as deeply as it had when it was younger. And so, I was ready to let go of my fears, to embrace whatever came next, and to allow myself to love again. Fully, without shame, without restraint, without fear. That a few weeks had passed since that night, and as the days unfolded, I found myself waking up with a new sense of purpose, a quiet joy that hadn't been there before. My world had shifted in ways I couldn't quite explain, but it felt right, like I was finally aligning with something true. Ryan and I had continued seeing each other. We talked about everything and nothing, our conversations flowing easily, as though we had known each other for years. Every moment with him felt like a discovery, a revelation of who we both were, who we could be, together. I had come to realize something in the days since our first kiss. Love didn't follow the rules. It didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for the right time, and it certainly didn't care about age, or appearances, or any of the other societal boundaries we placed on it. It just was, and the more I allowed myself to embrace it, the more I saw how powerful it could be, how transformative. Ryan was more than just a young man. He was a reminder that life could still be full of surprises, full of possibility. With him, I felt seen, heard, and appreciated, not as the woman I once was, but as the woman I was becoming. He had given me the courage to step outside of my own limitations, to look beyond the surface, to recognize the potential for love at any age. I had feared what others might think, what the world might say, but with time, those fears had faded. I realized that judgment from others had nothing to do with my happiness or my choices. What mattered was the truth of what I felt, the connection we shared, and the bond we were building together. People would talk, of course, but their opinions were just noise. My heart, Ryan's heart, those were the only things that mattered. Love had taught me something invaluable, that it is never too late to begin again. No matter how old we are, no matter how much time has passed, our hearts remain capable of great things. The love I had thought I had left behind was not lost, but rather waiting for me to recognize it again. And now, here it was, in the most unexpected place, in the arms of someone younger, someone who saw me, not as a number or a stereotype, but as a person worthy of love just as I was. I had spent too many years thinking that love was for the young, for the beautiful, for those whose lives were still unfolding. But that was a lie. Love is for everyone. It is timeless. It is boundless. It is the most powerful force in the world, and it doesn't follow the rules. It simply exists, waiting for us to accept it, to live it, without fear or hesitation. And so I move forward, with Ryan by my side, with love in my heart, ready for whatever comes next. The future is wide open, full of possibilities I never thought possible. And I am no longer afraid to embrace it all, to love deeply and without shame, to follow my heart wherever it leads. Because love, no matter the age, is always worth it.